The devastating tragedy of Cephalonia, in September 1943, which culminated in the wholesale massacre of over 5,000 Italian soldiers of the Acqui Division by German forces, was fundamentally triggered by the sudden seismic shift of the Italian armistice. On September 8, 1943, Marshal Pietro Badoglio's new government publicly announced Italy's unconditional surrender to the Allies. This crucial declaration instantly and radically transformed the Italian armed forces from a major Axis partner into an ambiguous, ill-defined entity scattered across occupied territories in Europe and the Balkans, often deep behind German lines. For the approximately 12,000-strong Acqui Division, which had been garrisoned on the remote, strategically minor Greek island of Cephalonia, the news created utter chaos and a profound, immediate crisis of loyalty, as they were suddenly isolated and surrounded by their former Axis comrades, the Germans, who now regarded them as potential enemies and traitors. The ruthless German reaction to the Italian surrender was one of immediate, overwhelming and brutal aggression, swiftly executed under the codename Operation Axis. Adolf Hitler, anticipating the inevitable armistice, had already prepared and issued highly detailed, explicit plans to disarm all Italian forces by force across Europe and the Balkans, and critically, to treat them not as legitimate prisoners of war, but as disloyal traitors. The local German forces on Cephalonia, numbering a much smaller contingent of approximately 2,000 men, immediately began seizing key strategic points like the harbour, communication centres, and airfields. The local German commander then issued a blunt, non-negotiable ultimatum to the Acqui Division: voluntarily surrender all heavy and light weapons to the Wehrmacht, and submit to disarmament and subsequent internment, or be treated as armed insurgents and face immediate military annihilation. This ultimatum placed the Acqui commander, General Antonio Gandin, in an impossible moral, professional, and ethical dilemma. General Antonio Gandin, the division's commander, faced immense, conflicting pressure from every possible direction. Personally, he was known as a dedicated anti-communist, held strong historical monarchist ties, and had previously maintained amicable professional relations with the local German commander. He desperately attempted a series of frantic, last-minute negotiations with the Germans, proposing an arrangement where the Italians could simply leave the island without surrendering their weapons, or even offer to fight jointly against any anticipated Allied landing. Crucially, however, his 12,000 troops, largely young, patriotic conscripts, were vehemently opposed to the dishonourable act of surrendering their arms to the hated Germans. Gandin, realizing that disarmament meant certain humiliation, forced labour, and loss of honour, finally put the decision to a direct democratic vote among his sub-commanders and indirectly his troops, seeking a resolution that upheld military dignity. The Acqui Division's decision to fight was not a strategic order dictated by Rome or London, but rather a spontaneous, deeply personal, and heroic act of collective conscience and military dignity taken by the soldiers themselves. The rank and file of the division, driven by a surge of patriotic pride and anti-German sentiment, voted overwhelmingly to reject the German ultimatum, consciously choosing the perilous path of armed resistance over shameful disarmament and potential deportation to brutal labor camps in Germany. This powerful act of defiance instantly transformed the division into one of the largest, most significant, though tragically short-lived, bodies of organized Italian resistance against Nazi Germany's military power. The troops' decision was fueled by a complex mixture of renewed patriotic fervor, genuine hatred for the Germans, who had often treated them with arrogance and contempt, and paralyzing fear of the rumored harsh conditions of internment. The resulting, uneven battle for control of the island, which erupted dramatically on September 13, 1943, raged for a grueling, bloody week. The Italian troops, despite their initially overwhelming numerical superiority, were desperately disadvantaged by overwhelming German firepower. They critically lacked effective air and anti-tank support, and their heavy artillery was quickly and efficiently silenced by concentrated German naval and land bombardment. The Germans, aided by landing reinforcements and overwhelming decisive air supremacy provided by relentless Stuka dive bombers, systematically pressed their attack with cold precision. The main Italian positions around the capital city of Argostoli were gradually overrun, and the Division S organized defense began to crumble under the relentless air and artillery strikes, quickly turning the conflict into a desperate, chaotic, house-to-house fight for survival. The crucial Allied response during this critical week was tragically absent, and this lack of intervention forms the uncompromising core of the enduring betrayal narrative. The Acqui Division frantically sent out repeated desperate radio messages requesting support, urgently requesting weapons, supplies, and crucially, air cover to neutralize the devastating German Stukas. However, the Allies, specifically the powerful British command in the Mediterranean, were already heavily committed to the precarious, massive landings at Salerno on the Italian mainland and the subsequent defense against German counterattacks. The ultimate strategic decision was coldly made to prioritize the mainland landings over diverting essential scarce resources to a distant, strategically non-essential island garrison, thereby effectively and tragically abandoning the fighting Italians to their grim fate against Hitler's explicit execution orders. The most direct and controversial Allied interaction involved a highly secretive British commando team that was already actually present on Cephalonia. This tiny team, led by Major Lord Alistair Fitzroy, was ordered to communicate with General Gandin to assess the situation, but was given explicit, written instructions not to get involved in the subsequent fighting, nor to offer any form of military aid or crucial air support. After the Italians bravely began fighting the Germans, the British team promptly executed a controversial retreat and evacuated the island, taking a handful of Italian officers with them. This abrupt retreat and lack of solidarity further cemented the feeling of abandonment and profound betrayal among the Acqui soldiers, and remains a dark, unforgivable footnote in the history of Allied commitment to their newly declared co-belligerence. The brutal turning point in the battle came decisively on September 22nd, when General Gandin, realizing the battle was irretrievably lost, his division surrounded and outmatched, and facing total annihilation, regretfully ordered his remaining men to cease fire. He and his senior officers were immediately taken prisoner by the overwhelming German forces. The subsequent German command was horrifyingly explicit and immediate. Following Hitler's direct, personal order, Führerbefehl, the captured Italian soldiers were not to be treated as legitimate prisoners of war under international law, but were to be summarily executed as traitors and Francs-Tireurs, irregulars or guerrillas, deliberately bypassing the protections afforded by the Hague and Geneva Conventions. The systematic massacre began immediately upon the cessation of fighting and lasted for several days of unimaginable, cold-blooded brutality. Small groups of Italian soldiers, often taken in pre-selected batches of 10 to 50 men, were marched at gunpoint to remote execution locations, including secluded beaches, steep ravines, and the notorious Casa Rossa barracks. They were then executed by firing squad. The German soldiers were methodical, disciplined, and utterly merciless, following their specific orders explicitly. Many Italians were brutally forced to dig their own mass graves before being lined up and shot. The stated German objective was not simply military victory, but the total exemplary elimination of the Acqui Division as a political warning and punishment for their resistance. The vast bulk of the executed soldiers were killed not during the intense week of open combat, but deliberately after they had formally surrendered and were prisoners. Conservative historical estimates place the number of those murdered in cold blood between 4,000 and 5,000 men, a devastating toll. These organized executions were carried out primarily by the German 966th Fortress Grenadier Regiment and mountain troops. The sheer, terrifying scale and systematic industrialized nature of the killing elevated the event from a common wartime atrocity to a deliberate, state-sanctioned war crime, confirming the ruthless implementation of Hitler's policy of treating the surrendered Italian forces with absolute, uncompromising mercilessness. Adding a complex layer to the horror, a substantial number of the captured Italian soldiers were hastily loaded onto two German transport vessels, the Ardina and the Sinfra, to be shipped to mainland Greece for internment in labor camps. Tragically, both ships were subsequently intercepted and sunk by massive Allied naval and air attacks while still in transit near the Greek coast. Hundreds of Italians drowned, many trapped helplessly in the crowded holds or machine-gunned in the water by German guards. This terrible event blurred the lines between German execution and Allied collateral damage, further complicating the questions of ultimate responsibility and the totality of the tragedy. The official German justification presented to the outside world for the atrocity was simple and self-serving. They claimed they were merely responding to the Italians' own alleged refusal to take German prisoners during the battle, an entirely unsubstantiated and cynical claim designed to legally justify the subsequent mass executions as legitimate wartime retaliation. However, the true, overriding motivation was clear and political. The massacre was a direct, chilling implementation of Hitler's political order that any Italian forces who chose to resist after the armistice were to be eliminated without mercy, establishing a terrifying, violent deterrent across all German-occupied parts of the Balkans. The lack of Allied air support was the most critical, devastating failure that definitively sealed the Acqui Division's fate and made resistance impossible. Had the Allies been able to provide even a single squadron of effective fighter aircraft to neutralize the German Stuka dive bombers and provide air cover, the Italians' dug-in artillery positions would have survived the initial onslaught, and the ground battle would have been fundamentally changed and prolonged. The High Command in Cairo, however, insisted that the air assets were absolutely non-transferable from the precarious Salerno beachhead, prioritizing the broader strategic goal of securing the Italian mainland, a decision that cost thousands of Italian lives. The local Greek population of Cephalonia played a tragic but deeply heroic role in the aftermath. Throughout the battle, many brave civilians provided the Italian soldiers with essential aid, including food, water, and intelligence about German movements. After the massacre, local priests, villagers, and nascent resistance fighters risked their own lives to secretly bury the dead, often in hastily dug mass graves, or hid hundreds of survivors from the relentless German patrols. This civilian assistance was morally crucial to preserving evidence of the systematic atrocity and saving the lives of the few hundred men who managed to escape the German dragnet and organized manhunts. The question of Allied intelligence and foresight remains deeply contentious and debated among historians. Allied commands in the Mediterranean were certainly aware of the Italian armistice and the high potential for a violent clash between former allies. However, the full, specific scale of Hitler's explicit directive for the total annihilation of all resisting Italian units was likely not fully appreciated, or it was cynically deemed militarily unavoidable given the severely limited resources available and the intense commitments elsewhere, Salerno. The significant communication difficulties between Gandin and Allied forces in the area further obscured the immediate, desperate, life-or-death nature of the crisis unfolding on the island. The incident stands historically as the single worst, most comprehensive war crime committed against regular, uniformed, non-civilian, non-partisan troops by the Wehrmacht during the entire war. Its sheer horrifying scale dwarfed any similar executions on the Western Front and established a terrifying, lethal precedent for the fate of disarmed Italian soldiers across all of German-occupied Europe, confirming the German commitment to eliminating any resistance, regardless of source, from their former allies. This deliberate disregard for the laws of war fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict in the Balkans. The few hundred Italian survivors who managed to escape the executions and the initial German dragnet often found essential shelter with the rapidly growing Greek resistance, ELAS movement, on the island and in the surrounding areas. They fought actively alongside the Greeks for the remainder of the occupation, forming small, highly effective bands of resistance fighters, conducting guerrilla warfare against the German garrisons. This integration demonstrated the resilience of the Italian troops' will to fight the German regime, even after the division's formal organized collapse, and established genuine solidarity with the local populace. In the immediate post-war era, the massacre was tragically and largely overshadowed by the sheer devastating scale of the Holocaust and other larger, more politically immediate atrocities committed across Eastern Europe. For decades, the tragedy remained a sensitive, painful footnote, particularly in Italy, where the young nation struggled internally to reconcile the historical image of a defeated, collaborationist fascist regime with the contrasting heroic martyrdom of the Acqui Division. The collective memory of the sacrifice was consequently kept alive primarily by the small circle of survivors and the mourning families of the victims. Formal international justice for the massacre was agonizingly slow, complicated, and ultimately unsatisfying. The German commanding general responsible for the entire region, General Hubert Lanz, was eventually tried in 1947 by a U.S. military tribunal for this and other crimes committed in the Balkans, but he received a relatively light sentence and was controversially released early. Later attempts in the 2000s by Italian and German prosecutors to identify and prosecute German officers involved directly in the mass executions were largely unsuccessful due to the insurmountable passage of time, the death of key witnesses, and complexities inherent in German jurisdiction and extradition law. The devastating news of the massacre had a profound, direct, and immediate rallying impact on the burgeoning Italian resistance movement, Resistenza, on the mainland. News of the Cephalonia executions, combined with similar German brutality against Italian troops in Albania and Yugoslavia, instantly removed any remaining ideological ambiguity about fighting the Germans. It rallied massive public support and dramatically increased recruitment for the partisan groups, definitively cementing the decision among Italian patriots that the only honorable path forward for the nation was an uncompromising armed struggle against the Nazi occupation forces. The story was eventually popularized internationally in 1994 by the hugely successful novel Captain Corelli's Mandolin by Louis de Bernière and the subsequent major film adaptation. While fictionalized and dramatized for effect, the book brought significant, much-needed global attention to the historical event, highlighting the personal tragedy, the rich cultural setting, and the sheer unforgivable brutality of the executions, successfully transforming the Cephalonia massacre from an obscure historical footnote into a widely recognized and potent act of wartime martyrdom and resistance. The memorialization of the Acqui Division remains a powerful, solemn act of remembrance and reconciliation. A vast, poignant mausoleum stands solemnly on Cephalonia, holding the scattered remains of many of the executed soldiers. Annually, moving ceremonies are held at the site, attended by high-ranking Italian and Greek officials, specifically honoring the soldiers' sacrifice and their collective decision to fight for dignity. The scattered graves and the mausoleum now serve as a potent, enduring symbol of Italian military honor, successfully restored through a voluntary act of resistance. One of the most ethically complex aspects of the entire tragedy is the uncomfortable question of shared responsibility not for the massacre itself, which was unequivocally German, but for the circumstances that enabled it. While the German forces were the direct, systematic perpetrators of the war crime, the Allies arguably bore the heavy strategic weight of choosing to prioritize the Salerno beachhead over the remote island. Additionally, the Kingdom of Italy, by leaving its large body of troops in exposed, isolated positions across the Balkans without a clear operational directive upon surrender, also inadvertently contributed to the fatal vulnerability of the Acqui Division. The German use of total, overwhelming air power with the dreaded Stuka dive bombers was a crucial, asymmetric, and psychologically devastating factor. The German air superiority was total and unchallenged. The loud, terrifying psychological effect of the Stuka's sirens and their precision dive bombing capabilities effectively shattered the Italians' morale, organizational capacity, and will to resist, especially among young conscripts who had never faced sustained aerial bombardment, quickly and decisively turning the tide of the ground battle in the Germans' favor. Ultimately, the tragedy of Cephalonia stands as a stark, chilling testament to the extreme brutality and the profound moral vacuum created by betrayal in total warfare. The Acqui Division was tragically betrayed first by its own government's sudden, ill-coordinated surrender, and then coldly abandoned by the Allies' strategic calculation and resource limitations. However, their final, heroic decision to fight for honor and dignity cemented their lasting place as martyrs of the Italian resistance, providing a vital, necessary, and enduring counter-narrative to the political shame of Italy's earlier alliance with Nazi Germany.